So, good morning, gentlemen, and everyone. Welcome to another episode of Dancing with Change in Facility Management. Today, we are very pleased to discuss P3s, which is a project structure that is gaining popularity. It's been around for a bit, but we really want to dig down into getting to understand what a P3 actually is, how it works, and how it benefits and or creates risk. All projects are risky. So we want to get into a conversation about that. So I'm pleased to have two experts on this subject that I want to introduce to you today, and that way we can jump right in and get a very exciting conversation going. So, firstly, I want to introduce David Baxter. David is an independent procurement planning consultant to public and the private sector. And he, in fact, spends his time with institutions like development banks, agencies globally focusing on P3s, and is also a WAP3 steering committee member. He engages with public and private sector collaborators on strategies to implement P3s. As the chair of WAP3's North American chapter, he works with counterparts in Mexico and Canada to build transnational alliances and advise institutions in North America, as well as Africa, Europe, and the Middle East and Asia, in implementing sustainable planning, procurement, and practices to navigate the challenges that complex procurements face so that they're transparent, competitive, resilient, and market tested. So, in leadership and consulting roles, he helps governments and aligned institutions develop ethical best practices and partnerships that allow them to utilize limited resources effectively, leverage innovation, and foster private sector collaboration. So, thank you for joining us, David. Also in the room is Sam Beydoun. Now he's an independent P3 expert. Sam acquired broad knowledge of transportation infrastructure programs and operations of highway networks and the development and administration of P3 projects and programs over 20 plus years of progressive roles in project and program development, procurement, and implementation of complex P3 projects in the US and within the federal government. He contributes to policies and programmatic initiatives participating internationally. He is an active member of WAP3, which is World Association of P3 units, and P3 professionals in the North American chapter. He wrote recently in connection with being a guest on the first Central Europe Working Group Partnership, um, Public Procurement and P3s. When properly designed and executed, P3 partnerships projects can create cost-effective and social value by accessing new sources of capital. However, poorly designed and executed, P3s will not only fail to deliver on these promises, but will also cost taxpayers money. So, there we go, some provocative introduction to the topic itself. And so I'm pleased to actually get into a conversation with our two guests. So, firstly, what is a P3?
Do you want to go ahead, Sam?
Sure. From the practitioner side, as a public sector practitioner, P3s to me is an alternative delivery method, other than the traditional design, bid, build, or public procurement, in accordance with the Public Procurement Act. So P3 allows the private sector to engage and participate in the delivery of public projects, whereby their experience and expertise and innovation will provide value for the public project, in the sense that They are managing that risk in the project that they can manage in most efficient way, while the public sector in this partnership can manage certain aspects of the risk because they're better suited to manage those risks. So the whole idea behind the partnership is to pull all the resources and innovation and their ability to manage the risk efficiently to provide a for a public for good public projects where the public will benefit from this partnership and delivery of the project, not just for in the construction and design and construction phase, but most of these P3s involve long-term operation maintenance aspect to it, as well as financing. So when we talk about P3, we talk about long-term arrangements that are based on risk allocation, efficient risk allocation, as well as providing for performance standards in accordance with the contractual agreement.
If I can just add some other thoughts and not in any way contradictory to what Sam has said, just, in support of that. I think the element that is most attractive to the public sector often is that public-private partnerships, as Sam mentioned, bring innovation, private sector, how would you call it, expertise to projects. But one thing that is driving the interest in this also is that they help bridge the funding gap because often the public sector would like to initiate a project, but it doesn't have enough funds. So they do enter into these innovative sharing sort of partnerships with the private sector to balance the risk, as Sam mentioned, but also to leverage the enormous resources and expertise that the private sector has, which the public sector often doesn't have. In many instances, the public sector or a local government institution would launch a project that's going to be a once-off project that they're only going to do once in the next 10 years. It could be a major bridge, a toll road or something. And they don't have that knowledge and that expertise. While in the private sector, there are companies that do this regularly all over the country and also globally. There is also, in the sense of in the past and the whole PPP, how would you call it, realm has evolved and new paradigms are emerging. In the past, it was all about maybe funding gaps. But now PPPs are being explored as a way to really make an impact on communities. So there's, new lines of thought that are coming out like people first PPPs. So putting the people into the PPP project. We can do any type of PPP project if the financial model is right. But are we choosing projects that are having impacts on the society or the community where they're being done is the big question. And this is becoming a priority, especially where PPPs are being seen as a way to leverage the achievement of countries or regions or nations or cities or whatever you want to call it. They help them to achieve their sustainable development goals. So in the past, there was a big discussion on value for money, which wasn't always just about money, is were we getting value for the money that was being spent, but it's also now morphing into value for people. So in the value for money assessment, people are paying an increasing amount of or increasing focus, as well as the value for the planet. And so as San also mentioned, we talk about PPP projects being very long. These are much longer than EPC contracts that could be 3, 4, 5 years. These ones sometimes are 30 years, and in some countries even get astronomical amounts of periods of time, like in Virginia. There was one for 99 years for the tunnels under the Hampton Roads area. And so what it is, and this is the big debate, and Sam and I have had many conversations about this, is that these projects also has to be sustainable and resilient because of the long-term commitment. And exactly as Sam said, the risk that has to be managed.
I think that having heard both of you mention that, I think timing is a risk, especially for public sector projects, and likely because that has everything to do with just changing priorities and or politics that may in fact have influence on these projects. I like the notion that they're getting very focused on people and community. Can either of you or both of you actually delve into what impacts this is having on the facility management side of the business and whether that's being viewed in positive or cautious language?
Maybe I'll hit the ground running here this time. In any of the projects that I work on, and we set up the terms of reference, the TORs or TORs, however you want to reference it, one of the things that is critically important in PPPs is setting up a project management plan. And this is, involves everything from the operations and the maintenance, the commitments, the desired outcomes, the standards, etc. And you can imagine how difficult this is because under an EPC contract where you're just designing and building, once you're done, you're finished. And then it's, you move on, it's a turnkey project. But when you're setting up these project management plans, these project management strategies, if you want to call them, they are all tied to a number of things, and that is ongoing delivery of the service or the functioning of the utility, tied to the budget and the financial plan which was established under the PPP, and then the uncertainty of the next 20, 30 years. I mean, pretty much these are based on what we know now, but what is it going to look like in 20 years' time? What's it going to look in 30 years' time? And as the project ages, how do you ramp up operations and well, how do you ramp up maintenance to ensure that the project continues to operate? And so those are some of the, asset assessments, asset management folks. This is critically important because it requires ongoing monitoring. If you don't monitor, you don't know the status of the project. And if you don't know the status of the project, it means you're in a world of hurt because things can happen. I mean, you can just think of that bridge in Genoa about, was it 2, 3 years ago, which was a PPP project, which wasn't being managed and it collapsed calamitously. And I don't know how many people it killed, etc. And then all the finger pointing and the blaming took place afterwards. When if it had a proper asset management, project management, operations management, you can whatever you want to call the plan in place, and they had been doing checks, following up with professionals who are tasked with this sort of skill set, I think this type of thing could have been avoided.
Yeah, if I may add to what David has said, in terms of facilities management. If we go back and remember what we said earlier, that these contracts, the P3 arrangements, are performance based. What that means is the public sector and engage in the private sector would say, I want these facilities to be managed to certain standards and to be maintained to certain standards. And it's the responsibility of the operator or the maintainer of these facilities to develop and think ahead, about what is involved in delivering on those performance requirements for the next 30, 40, 50 years. The implications here is when in P3, when we start looking at the maintaining and operating the facility long term, we start thinking about those standards early on during the design and construction. Okay, because if the private sector can design it more efficiently, okay, that will reduce their cost for maintenance and operation long term, and that's where the value really becomes important in P3 agreements. I'll give you just a quick example. On one of the projects I worked on, and it has, in the facility, along the facility, there was a bridge that needed to be reconstructed or constructed, and the public entity provided minimum requirement standard for the rebar installation, in building the bridge deck, and that had to be a coated steel. Well, when the public sector came back with the proposal, they said because the design life for the bridge is like 75 years, so they have to maintain, somebody has to maintain that for the life of the project. So the private sector proposed to use stainless steel bars, which is a lot more expensive, to construct early on, but reducing the cost of operation maintenance down the road really provided a great value. So the idea here for the maintainer and operator is they get involved early on in these processes and they understand what's required to be and what are the performance standards over the life of the project, and they build that into their financial model and into their program. So there won't be any surprises down the road. Just if I made to contrast that with a publicly delivered project, when the public sector builds a project like that, they have the money and the funding, assuming that they have the money and the funding to construct it, but they leave the maintenance and operation to chance. If they do have funding coming in, they will maintain it, and if they don't, they get into what we call the deferred maintenance, okay, and operations. So it costs lot more money to replace and to operate those facilities down the road. So, the by when we look at evaluating the value for money, we have to take that into consideration when we start looking, comparing apples to apples. What are the standards are being maintained under the PPP delivery? We compare that to the standards that these public sector taking on those risks for maintaining and operating those facilities themselves. And most often you'll probably find a really good value by the delivering the project through a public-private partnership.
I think that's such a great point because if there's one big complaint from facility management about projects is the lack of their ability to get involved in some of the design decisions, whether it's engineering or architecture, and that they then are just handed off, boom, a new project. Okay, it's yours, run with it. And for all of those reasons that both of you just mentioned, that really strains not only long-term life cycle of a built element, but also budgets. And I would certainly suggest that a P3 has this huge advantage of absolutely involving facility management right from the beginning with input into the design right through to years of management.
Could I add one thing quickly? You
Sure.
know, Sam mentioned basically, sort of the deferred maintenance and sort of where government tends to be what you call reactive. Under a PPP, you have to be proactive because you've got very, very specific measures of delivery that you have to meet, things that you have to do. And I think one thing that is a struggle, but it's evolving in PPPs, which is becoming more and more important, is that we are seeing tremendous adverse natural events, climate events that are happening on projects. If you just think of the Gulf region, you think of the fires in California, the list seems to be never ending and increasing. And that adds an extra element of this operations and maintenance, sustainability and resilience to PPPs. So what you are finding is that in these management plans, these strategic management plans or operation plans, they call them different things, but they're all basically the same. The one thing that is really important is also that these plans have to be flexible and adaptable because circumstances change. And I mean, I could start as a project manager on a PPP project now, and if it was going to be 30 years' time, I'm not going to be around. Either I'm retired without any interest of working, or I have expired, sort of thing. And so it's really important that the team that is employed to do the operations, the maintenance, the condition assessments, etc., is constantly briefed by the project managers so that they are aware and that there is transition planning for team members. So this is why these plans are also important, so that you don't want everything to be in the mind of one person who retires, has a stroke, has an accident, whatever, and all that institutional knowledge is gone. So, when we talk about sustainability, it's not just sustainability about the infrastructure, but sustainability of the maintenance team. When we talk about resilience, do they understand what resilience is? And when we talk about adaptation, do they have the flexibility in the contracts to adapt them so that they can continue to do their maintenance and operations requirements, commitments in effectively. And I think one thing that, which is also important, it's great to have all these plans and all these strategies and that, but if there's no accountability, it's just a waste of time. And so this is also really important that people are identified to manage the risk. The risk is quantified. Mitigations identified, but then there also have to be people that are held accountable to that because otherwise it just gets ignored. I mean, I don't know if it's happened to Sam, but I've worked on projects overseas and you go into the operations office of a big project and you ask, can I see your manual? Half the time they don't know where it is. And if they do know where it is and they pull it out, it's covered in dust and cracks when you open it, which is a scary sound because it means they've never looked at it. So just some thoughts in that regard.
Actually, that's such a good point. Go ahead, Sam.
Yeah, no, I was going to say that, the heart of the PPP arrangement is providing, mentioned this a couple times, value for money. So what that means is when we enter these agreements, at the conclusion of the procurement process, we base our decision to enter into these agreements on the value that's being provided from this arrangement, the public and private sector. And if we don't, once we build it and gets into operation, if we don't monitor the performance under the operation and maintenance phase of the project, how do we know that we maintain that value for money? So, like David said, there has to be some kind of monitoring and accountability. That's why, in my experience as a practitioner, it's important to set those performance criteria when you issue the procurement document. So the private sector, the potential private sector partner knows exactly what is it that they're going to deliver, what they're going to be judged on. And, and to manage that process, you provide for incentives. I also have provide for, well, when I say incentive, it could be positive incentives or negative incentives in the sense that if they fall short, there are penalties or there are deductions from their revenues or the whatever is promised to them. But also there could be incentive for them to perform better than the minimum standards to provide better projects. So that's why we call them these are performance, agreements. And if we don't monitor that, we lose that value. We lose that knowledge of, are we still providing that value 20, 30, 40 years down the road? So it's important to have those contracts written very properly and with the management of the project long term from the operation maintenance perspective.
This
If,
sounds
if I,
to me
sorry,
like,
if I could just add one thing, because Sam really hit the nail on the head on one thing, is on the incentives. When a company is doing well on a PPP, it's going to maintain its profit margin because it's balancing its financial commitments with the delivery, etc. Unfortunately, that sometimes happens in countries that I work in, is when the project is being so well maintained, not because they're cheating and cutting corners, but because they're doing a good job. Often governments then want to claw back some of the profit because they're saying they're making more money out of the project than they should have been. But they're not making money because they're cheating or whatever. They're making money because they are keeping the project pristine, as it should be. And so when we talk about incentives and also, unfortunately in contracts, there's always, risk that you could be penalized for bad performance. We need to be very careful that we don't penalize for good performance, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
wow, that's interesting. That one I've not heard of before, but
Well, I mean, since we're having free conversation here, if I may add just one little tiny point here to the performance incentives. When we get into these projects, the public sector, they're providing the bare minimum performance, to the public. When we have the private sector managing these projects, because they're investing their capital in there for over long term and they're getting return on investment, they view that as a business proposition and they view the user as their customers. So they have all the incentives in the world to make sure that they are providing good projects and maintaining it properly and operating properly. So their customers will keep coming back, and paying for the service because they recognize the value of that and they keep coming back. And many of our private sector partners that we have, contracted with in the past, they engage in public relations, they engage in marketing. They're not just operating, maintaining, but also they're community, part of the community, they're community activists. So, um, it provides for really good performance, provides for good incentives for the private sector, for the public sector, and the users of the facilities themselves.
Yeah, it sounds like it's really a great invitation for engaging. Certainly the facility management group, so that their knowledge and input ends up being part of the design focus, and also the ongoing interaction with who knew the users.
That's right.
So it sounds like it's a really plus plus project um, structure for facility management involvement and input.
Yep.
Yeah, and just also,
Agree.
when we talk about that input, it also should be coming more and more from multiple stakeholders.
Yes.
Typically, in the very first type of PPPs that were done, there were only two stakeholders, the public and the private sector. But now there are also communities involved. There are users, the consumers of the project, and they should have a voice because often, you're going to find out that there are things wrong with your project from the users, not the people that are sitting remotely and monitoring it.
That's interesting. If I can just share one example of a P3 project that I was involved with. I liked the structure. It was actually the first P3 I was involved with, but it was structured right from the beginning with sort of skin in the game, so that the design construction team was 80%, the FM was 20% during the design construction phase. And then that flipped so that once it was in operation, facility management owned 80% of the stake and the design and construction 20%. I really liked that balance because it invited that there was a lot more collaboration, which in this industry for years has not been strong. So this was a really good incentive to actually appreciate a broader input. And actually I saw, just by way of examples, that FM input, this was a hospital, so it made a lot of sense because things change so quickly in a hospital daily, and facility management folks, operations, maintenance, their stories of how things actually work, what fails, what doesn't, was quite valuable in the design of the new building. Did you folks also have those kinds of experiences?
Sam?
Yeah, I mean, when we put out these from public sector perspective, when we put out these requests for proposal or requests for qualifications, the focus on delivering the good service over the long term starts early on when the responders start pulling together their teams and their teaming agreements. And when they get into the creation of this special purpose vehicle, to manage the project, you'll find the designers have a stake in the project. Of course, the operation maintenance folks are also involved, and they provide long-term equity and probably financing into the project. Because, like I said earlier, it is a business to them, but it's not just a business for building something and getting return on investment. If they want to sustain their business over the long term, they have to start early in the design phase and meeting those objectives, goals and objectives of the project, and meeting those performance standards. Not just meet them, but also most of the time exceeding them. So it is, you know, it is something that everyone gets involved and they get involved early. And the projects that I have experienced great success and delivered good services and goals on the goals and objectives of the project are the team that stayed together all along, all the time. Okay. Um, they're not just here to design it, just pull away from it. And they got their money and they got out. Now it's somebody else's problem. They all have stake in the project over the long term. We had recent example here that where things went sideways, not necessarily, you know, it is a bad project, but the Purple Line in Maryland, where we had, you know, a contractor that was involved and there were some delays and things like that, and they wanted to pull out, and that created a whole lot of problems for the project on both on the private sector side and public sector side. So when we get into these RFQs, request for qualification early on, and that's a cue for the private sector to start looking their partners, who they're partnering with, and what is the long-term commitment, whether it's through equities, you know, that they have skin in the game, or it's a, you know, partnership on other projects you know, with the team. So it's something that the operation maintenance folks, you know, they look at their business model. They say, this is something we want to do. This is something we want to pursue, and we're going to invest in it for the long term.
I could add one thing to that very quickly. Sorry,
No,
is
go
when we talk about the project management team, we've also got to get a sense that it's not just the private sector special purpose vehicle company that's managing the project. Often there's this idea that you can award the PPP project and you'll say, "I'll see you in 30 years' time," and hopefully everything goes well. These monitoring project there's two levels of monitoring, let's call it that. There's the monitoring of the project by the private sector operator, but there also has to be monitoring of the operator by the public sector to ensure that everything is taking place. And this is what I always counsel governments that I work with, that when you are creating a PPP project and you're creating a PPP team, you still have to have somebody in place and you have to set budget aside to ensure that there's an actual, not a contract manager in a sense who just is going to check off and sign on things, but you actually have a project manager who knows as much about that project as the private sector project manager knows. Because if that doesn't occur, then it's just a reliance on quarterly reports or whatever, hearsay. And if it's not verified and all of that, things can go south very quickly.
So on that note, and given your experience in a number of areas, can you enlighten us about some of the projects, P3 projects that have not performed as well as anticipated, what went wrong, and how that learning then allowed better performance for projects in the future because that learning was applied? You don't have to name names, but
I can mention two that I worked on, and I was going to talk about the Purple Line project because it's my favorite as well. But Sam and I, were, I was living in Virginia when it happened, and it's almost a case study on how not to do a PPP project. And in many of the trainings and that I use that one. But just examples of, where projects have failed. There's one is toll roads. Okay, and these are very controversial. And um, in Albania, for example, a toll road was built between Albania and Kosovo to improve the traffic movements between the two countries. It's a good project, really good project, because it through tunnels and that it cut out horrible mountainous passes which were deathly in winter, etc. And the project was good, the rationale was good, the financial model was good, etc. Everything was good about it, but they made one fatal mistake. And that was that they forgot to consult with the community.
Mm.
And so the community for years was used to going between Albania and Kosovo and just traveling free because that's how it worked. And suddenly one day they came up and had a slam on brakes because there was a toll plaza in front of them. And, here you suddenly had to pay for a road that, or the concept that you never paid for before. Well, what was the result? The communities on both sides went berserk and they burnt down the toll roads, and the government landed up having to buy out the concession and operate it as a free situation. The
Wow.
same thing happened in my home city, I mean, in my home country of South Africa, for the World Soccer Cup. They built a brand new toll road between Johannesburg and Pretoria. And they, to help the people feel good about it and etc. During the soccer cup, the toll road was free, and there was a grace period of 6 months afterwards where the toll road would be free, and then people had to start paying for it. But people got so used to using it free that as soon as the toll roads came up and they started being charged for it, the same thing happened. They went berserk, but burnt down all the toll gates and everything. And the South African government, or the Gauteng government, I think it was, in the province, they had to cancel the project at enormous cost to them because they still had the commitments that they had, given guarantees to the private sector. So what am I trying to say is, we often look at the engineering for failure, we look at the operations for failure, but often we forget to look at the community aspects of it, which can also cause failure in projects.
That's such a good point. The whole notion of having a communication plan and having it actually implemented probably just as a build up to the project and then all the way through. Yeah, that's a really good point. So I've actually heard of a number of P3s referencing the community aspect that have ended up with a shorter lifespan, and namely because of the community input, similar to what you've just talked about. But it was actually with schools. And schools have a lot of very strong community involvement for the most part. And, the parents of the kids like to have lots of input into how schools are built and operated and everything else. So, have either of you experienced that kind of community disengagement as well, or has it only been with toll roads cost?
I, Sam, you want to go ahead? I do have an example.
No, I'll just say, speak in general terms. I have, witnessed some great successes in school delivery, project delivery, in particular in the eastern side of Maryland, where the county has, over it's taken some time because they have multiple schools and funding becomes, it trickles in, so to speak. But the idea here is, yes, there's an opportunity there for the public sector to engage the private sector and look at the total program and phase in these projects, a little bit at a time. But yes, that's part of the community engagement part where the money's coming from the parents and taxpayers and all that. So they have to build it, and there's a lot of lead time between projects that gets into the local approvals, where they have to take it um, to the county or municipalities board and have public hearings on these things and where the money is coming from and how is the private sector is involved in all that. So community engagement is important. And the other example that I have is another community that wanted to deliver schools, but they couldn't really get over that hurdle of getting public acceptance for the private sector to manage to build and deliver schools, in their backyard. And
Right.
and why would the private sector would want to make money on building and maintaining a school if it's my tax dollars already paid for these things? So yeah, I mean, there has to be public engagement and public acceptance, and political leadership could change. Okay, and that's why these projects for schools in particular, it takes several administration to deliver. Okay, because they're being delivered over a long period of time over a program. And I also heard that, in places like in the UK, for example, where the government is in charge, they design and construct a project, then the next municipality or county or city, whatever it is they want to deliver, they just take that project off the shelf and put it out for procurement. Yeah, so it all depends on the people you're engaged with, and in the communities. If they are acceptant to these things, that's great. It works fine. But there's a lot of work ahead of time preparing for such project with public involvement. That's not different than building a toll road, for example, or expansion. And where David lived in Northern Virginia, we had a project um, um, that we called the I-66 outside the Beltway. That lead time for the project, it took, 3 or 4 years working on it from the public sector to get it into procurement. But in the meantime, we had to conduct about 150 public engagement for the project and have meetings, and you can't imagine what goes on in some of these discussions to the level that you have to meet, like with the community, small community group to get them to accept, probably buying a parcel in their community or running this road in their community. So yeah, it takes a lot of work, but it's something that's long. If you have a good case for the project, to build in the project and deliver the good story, more than likely you'll see people agree to it.
I
I,
think that firstly, that's been my experience too. But the lead up to this is probably not appreciated enough. And I would say that that would likely also extend to other project delivery models. But the prep work up front is huge. But it should be huge for any project, I think. So, and I and maybe this is something that can relate back to risk for sure on many levels. So, can you tell me? I mean, it's an obvious answer, but the uh, the impact that a good project leader has on a project delivery, and regardless the model. So we just need to understand how, if at all, valuable a project manager is in this case.
I could add some things. I think, first of all, for an effective project manager, he has to or she has to know very clearly what their mission is and what their deliverables are in that. Because if they don't know that and they go to a public hearing or to a stakeholder meeting and they give the wrong information or that don't seem to know what's happening, they've lost the trust of that community immediately, and it's never going to come back. So, you talked about communication plans. They really have to be very, very transparent, open, participatory, and any good project manager will appreciate good feedback from the community on whatever the project is. Because if there's dissatisfaction, and Sam also touched on it, political pressure because of community dissatisfaction, that can kill the project outright. I mean, no matter how good it is, how noble its intentions are, etc., there's going to be problems. And just one thing I wanted to get back, to schools and hospitals, and I wanted to tie those two together. These are public services that are critical and are considered, almost a right and not just a privilege or, something along those lines. And so, the communities for those type of projects are going to be extremely sensitive to anything that's happening in that regard. So if you have a project manager who almost doesn't have an open door policy, where people can come and talk to them, they're going to think, well, what are you hiding? Why are you not working with us? And that gets lost. But the project manager also in that communication should not just be communicating with his staff. And unfortunately, there are a lot of people who don't communicate with their staff. They should be communicating if it's in a school, if they're responsible for the operation and maintenance of the school, they should be collaborating and communicating with the teachers who are most probably employed by the county or the state or whatever, so that their needs are being heard because there's two bodies involved in that institution. But then they should also be communicating constantly with the government project manager and um, you know, like the old days, when you walked into a project manager's office and they were filing cabinets up to the ceiling and piles of paper on his or her desk. And, you know, you ask a question and they had a befuddled, confused look on their face because they don't even know where to start in the paperwork. With the modern technology we have with artificial intelligence, with all sorts of things that we can do, no project manager shouldn't have the information just at the tip of his or her fingers immediately. So that free flow, that willingness to share information, and also I think making it clear that there is certain proprietary or contractual information that's not everyone's business, and people will understand that. You don't have to share everything and throw the book out, but things that impact people should be shared. Things that impact the project should be shared, and there should be a two-way communication so that the project manager knows what's happening on his project, her project, from all aspects, a holistic viewpoint.
This whole notion of communication, I think, has been a challenge for project delivery forever. And and I think that there's certainly more opportunity with technology to improve on communication. But there's also trials with that too. And perhaps it's because not every party involved uses the same technology. There's still an ongoing concern, maybe not on P3, so we can talk about this, but there's an ongoing concern with a building handover from end of construction to the operations facility management side of things. So certainly in my discussions with others, we believe that technology has got a huge role in that. I mean, it's time for the three-ring binder to be in the history books, and same with hard copy rolled up drawings. So, can you talk about how a P3 could actually improve both on communication technology throughout the project duration itself, and then also on just a better way to seamlessly move it into the operations and maintenance side of things with digital records instead of hard copy?
No, you're absolutely right, Kathleen. There is a big challenge, whether we deliver the project in a traditional way or we deliver it, particularly if we deliver it in the P3 arrangement. That when we get into the design phase and thinking about the project and the value story and the benefit cost analysis and the cost estimation and all the assumptions around that before we get into the procurement documents or the procurement phase and developing the procurement documents, we don't capture all of those nuances, having the private discussion, for example, why we chose to go this way. So all of that is part of the knowledge base that if we don't manage that properly, it could get lost, like you mentioned, from the procurement phase to the implementation phase, which includes the design, construction, and operation maintenance down the road. What happened from my experience most often is we were in a procurement office and we negotiated these P3 agreements. And once we get it, under a signature, and we take that whole binder, three-ring binder, or that volume of contract, we toss it over our shoulder to the district engineer and say, here, you manage it, you build it. And that is a challenge. We have started many different ways of communicating with those folks who are going to manage this project at the local level. in the sense what we start bringing them early on in the discussion so they can capture and be familiar with why we designed it this way. Why did we make the decision to go with, a stainless steel bar versus the steel coated bar in building the bridge, and what is the expectation from doing this alternative technical concept, if you will. So we started to do that, and hopefully we can continue that. One of the areas of research that, I work also with the University of Maryland is what knowledge base do we need to build for the for the public sector to manage these projects over the long term. Now, in my work advising overseas entities, is the project management, okay, over the long term is a really big challenge. It's simply because many of the things that we have mentioned, people that they were there at the negotiation, they're not there at the implementation. Even if the people were at the implementation phase, sitting at the discussions early on, they may not last long. They may get different jobs and move on to different things or retire, whatever. And all of that knowledge management that we communicated to these folks early on gets lost. So there has to be a way to manage that communication and have whether it's built-in information management system, the BIM, whatever the case may be, to capture all that information in there and have continual conversation with these folks. One thing that we don't focus a lot on is training the people who are managing these projects. Okay. Training is very important. It's not just put out an advertisement for, we're hiring a project manager and okay, here you are, manage this project. It takes a long time to train them because these arrangements are very complex in terms of long-term operation maintenance. So we need to build that knowledge base, communicate that with them, and include the training to teach them on what are the expectations are over the long term.
I have just a comment on that also, I think, and it supports what Sam is saying, you need to also have a retrievable interactive archive, if you want to call it that, that has captured every decision that was made and why it was made. And it needs to be, how would you call it, accessible easily, and there's software out there now that you can, why did we decide to use stainless steel instead of, and you don't have to go to an archive and look through 500 construction drawings to come up with it, for example. But what's important is that this management database, this knowledge, this realm of knowledge eventually forms the basis of the best practices history of that project, which becomes the culture of that management group. And so if you can capture these decisions, have them readily accessible, they become best practices which enforce the operations and maintenance management culture of the group, if that makes sense.
Yeah, not to belabor the point, but if I may add one thing, if we have a good knowledge management system during implementation and the management of the project, if a dispute comes around, okay, we can go to that knowledge management system and figure out why we decided to do it that way. And we can avoid a lot of the disputes and a lot of the delays in the project if we have captured all that information and put it in this project man and communicated that from the procurement team to the implementation team. And we can avoid a lot of delays and costly litigation and all that simply by making sure we have good communication in place.
I think that's such a strong theme. You know what? I'm going to invite both of you to further discussion on this, simply because of time, for sure, but also because I think we've hit on something you have certainly talked about the critical importance of really good communication and really good documentation. And what I also want to explore further is how we can take that learning right through to procurement so that when we go to set up a project, we go to procure the resources, the people, and so on, that we've actually looked at this is the end in mind and the steps that we actually got to the end. We want to capture all of that and go to market with a comprehensive ask described and all of the elements that we actually want that project to have. Particularly, a strong one is good communication, but longevity too, and handoff over time, because you know, if a project is 20 years or 30 years, there will be handoff, there will be changes. And so that too becomes an important part, I think, of the procurement information. So, can we do that? That's
Sure.
I
And one aspect that would really we can defer that to the next discussion is when it comes to the end of the life cycle of the project or the contract, the handback provisions and what
yes.
documentation we need to have in place, what performance standards we need to monitor before we get to the day or the week or a month or a year, for when the private sector is turning over this project to the public sector. So
And
This is
I'd like to add to what Sam has said. Handback is most often totally ignored, or it's not even basically in the contract. And suddenly the public sector is faced with getting a massive project back that it actually doesn't want back, because most times they don't want it because that's why they gave it out in the first place. And that would be a very interesting conversation because are they prepared for the handback? What is their plan B? Are they going to re-procure it? Are they going to end the project? Are they going to work with the incumbent in a contract extension or whatever? These are many things that institutions are grappling with. And specifically now that about 30 years ago, PPPs were being embraced madly. We're 30 years on now. The average of a 30-year contract, there are thousands, if not hundreds of thousands, of PPP projects that are maturing and ending. And PPP units and governments really around the world are panicking because they don't want those projects back. They were excited to hand it off. Now it's coming back to them, and they don't know how to handle that.
Oh, this is brilliant. I really see P3s as such a learning opportunity for project delivery, period. Like no matter the model. I think there's just so much to be learned by this. So I'm really interested in having a further discussion and exploring these details and broader view. And in the meantime, I'm actually going to dig into, where the projects that I worked at, where they stand now, because it's been a bit of time. So perhaps that will be some more information to add to this concern about end of life project, right? Well, I just really want to thank both you, Sam, and you, David, for this really good conversation and excellent information. Uh, the facility management group community can really benefit by this. So, looking forward to the next conversation. Thank you very much.
thank you. We appreciate the opportunity.